There are moments in live television when something is said that cannot be unsaid, when words slip out that reveal beliefs that should have stayed hidden, when the comfortable mask of civility drops and exposes something ugly underneath. And there are moments when someone with a platform and a microphone decides that letting those words pass unchallenged would be a greater sin than disrupting the comfortable flow of entertainment. When 54-year-old Margaret Collins made a comment on the Family Feud stage in August 2025 that she clearly thought was harmless, maybe even funny, she had no idea that Steve Harvey would stop the entire show, that he would spend the next hour confronting not just her words, but the attitudes those words represented, and that what happened next would spark a national conversation about casual racism, unconscious bias, and the responsibility we all have to speak up when we witness discrimination. What you are about to see is not comfortable. It is not easy, but it is necessary. Before we dive into this story of confrontation, education, and the moment one man refused to let racism slide by unchallenged, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Because what you are about to witness will remind you that silence in the face of bigotry is complicity, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to let hateful words go unanswered. The Family Feud studio that Thursday afternoon in August was filled with typical game show energy. Two families stood ready to compete, and the atmosphere suggested this would be a standard, enjoyable episode. On one side stood the Williams family from Detroit, a black family that included grandmother Loretta Williams, 68, her daughter Patricia, 42, Patricia's husband Marcus, 45, and their two children, Shanice, 19, and Jerome, 17. They were warm and funny, the kind of family that made good television. On the other side stood the Collins family from suburban Minneapolis, a white family that included Margaret Collins, 54, her husband Bill, 56, their son Tyler, 28, their daughter Emily, 25, and Emily's husband Josh, 27. They appeared to be what America would call a typical middle-class family, comfortable and confident. Steve Harvey worked the stage with his usual energy, getting both families warmed up, making jokes, establishing rapport. The game began normally, with both families playing well and the audience enjoying the competition. The Williams family had a slight lead after the first round, celebrating their points with enthusiastic high fives and laughter. Then came the second round, and the question that appeared on the board was, name a profession where you need to be well-spoken. It was designed to be straightforward, generating answers like lawyer, teacher, news anchor, salesperson. The Williams family went first. Patricia answered, news anchor, which was the number one answer. The family erupted in celebration, and Steve high-fived them all around. Then it was the Collins family's turn at the buzzer. The survey question appeared again, and Steve turned to Margaret Collins. Margaret, name a profession where you need to be well-spoken. Margaret buzzed in confidently. Politician, she said, which was a good answer and appeared on the board as number 2. Her family celebrated, and Steve was about to move to the next question when Margaret, caught up in the moment, added something that she clearly thought was just casual commentary. Of course, Margaret said with a laugh, you would think news anchor would require being well-spoken, but half the time I cannot even understand what they are saying anymore. It is like they just hire anyone these days without checking if they can actually speak English properly. The studio went quiet. Not the dramatic silence of a shocking reveal, but something more uncomfortable, the silence that comes when people are not sure they heard what they think they heard and are waiting to see how it will be handled. Steve Harvey's expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared. His entire posture shifted. He looked at Margaret for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the lightness that had been there seconds earlier. What did you just say? Margaret, not reading the room, continued in the same casual tone. You know what I mean. Some of these news anchors, they have such thick accents or they use slang or they just do not sound professional. It is hard to take them seriously. Steve Harvey set his cards down on the podium with deliberate care. He looked at the producers and made a hand gesture that clearly meant stop everything. The game music cut off. The energy in the room shifted completely. On, Steve said, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made everyone in the studio pay attention. I need you to explain to me what you meant by that, because what I think I heard was you saying that news anchors do not speak English properly, and I want to know who specifically you are talking about. Margaret finally seemed to realize that something had gone wrong, though she clearly did not understand what. I am not talking about anyone specific, I am just saying that standards have dropped. That networks hire people who do not speak as clearly as they used to. Standards have dropped, Steve repeated. He looked at the Williams family, who were standing very still, their earlier joy completely evaporated. Loretta Williams, the grandmother, had her arms crossed and an expression that suggested she had heard this exact sentiment many times before in many different contexts. Steve looked back at Margaret. And when you say people do not speak English properly, are you by any chance referring to black news anchors? Are you talking about the way black people speak? Margaret's face flushed. I did not say anything about race. I am talking about professionalism, about speaking clearly. No, Steve said, and his voice was harder now. You said you cannot understand what they are saying. You said it is like they hire anyone these days. And you said this right after a black family gave the number one answer about news anchors needing to be well-spoken. So I am going to ask you directly, were you talking about black people? The studio was holding its breath. Margaret's family looked uncomfortable, with her daughter Emily visibly cringing. Margaret herself seemed caught between doubling down and trying to backtrack. I think you are reading too much into what I said, Margaret finally responded. I was just making a general comment about communication standards. Steve Harvey shook his head slowly. No, ma'am, you do not get to do that. You do not get to make a racist comment and then act like I am the problem for calling it out. So let me be very clear about what just happened here. You made a statement that implied that certain news anchors, who you claim you cannot understand, are not speaking English properly. And the only reason you would say you cannot understand English spoken by professional journalists is if you are making assumptions based on their race or ethnicity. He turned to the Williams family. Mrs. Williams, did you understand what Margaret was saying just now? Loretta Williams nodded, her expression grim. I understood perfectly. I have been hearing variations of that comment my entire life. It is code. It is a way of saying that black people, or people with accents, or people who do not sound white, are less professional, less intelligent, less worthy of respect. Steve turned back to Margaret. That is exactly what it is. And whether you intended it that way or not, that is what you said. You made a comment that suggested that people who do not speak in a very specific way, a way that typically means white and Midwestern American English, are not speaking properly. Margaret tried again. I really think you are misinterpreting what I meant. I have nothing against anyone, I have black friends. The phrase, I have black friends, landed like a stone. Several people in the audience actually groaned. Steve Harvey closed his eyes briefly, as if summoning patience. Ma'am, saying you have black friends does not give you permission to say racist things. In fact, if you actually have black friends, I would encourage you to ask them how they feel when people talk about the way they speak, or suggest that they do not sound professional enough, or imply that they need to change the way they communicate to be taken seriously. He walked to the center of the stage, positioning himself between the two families. I am going to explain something to everyone watching right now. What Margaret just said is what we call a microaggression. It is not overt racism. She did not use a slur. She did not explicitly say anything about black people. But what she did was perpetuate a racist idea, which is that there is one correct way to speak English, and that way happens to be the way that white people typically speak. And anyone who deviates from that is unprofessional or hard to understand or lacking in standards. Patricia Williams, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Mr. Harvey, my daughter Shanice is studying broadcast journalism at Howard University. And one of the first things she was told when she started the program was that she would need to code switch. That she would need to learn to speak differently on camera than how she speaks with her family and friends. Not because the way she naturally speaks is wrong or unprofessional, but because people like Margaret will judge her if she does not sound white enough. Shanice, the 19-year-old daughter, added quietly, I have been told my whole life that I am articulate, as if people are surprised that a black girl can speak well. As if articulate is a compliment and not an insult, because the only reason you would be surprised that someone is articulate is if you assumed they would not be. Steve Harvey nodded. That is exactly it. And Margaret, I want you to understand something. When you made that comment about not being able to understand news anchors, you were not just making an observation. You were perpetuating a system that tells black people and people of color, and people with accents that they need to change who they are to be acceptable, that they need to speak differently to be professional, that their natural way of communicating is wrong. Margaret was crying now, though whether from shame or from being called out was unclear. I did not mean it that way. Was not trying to be racist. I believe you did not mean it that way, Steve said, and his voice softened slightly but remained firm. I believe you thought you were just making a casual comment, but that is the problem. Racism is not just cross burnings and hate crimes. Racism is also the casual comments that slip out, the assumptions we make, the way we judge people based on how they look or sound. And just because you did not intend to be racist does not mean your words were not racist. He looked at the audience, many of whom were visibly uncomfortable. I know this is not what people came here to see today. You came to watch a game show. You came to laugh and have fun. But I cannot let what Margaret said pass without addressing it. Because if I do, if I just laugh it off and move on, I am telling everyone watching that these kinds of comments are acceptable. And they are not. Loretta Williams spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of 68 years of lived experience. Young lady, I want you to hear something from me. I am 68 years old. I grew up in Mississippi during segregation. I have been called every name you can imagine. I have been told I do not belong in certain spaces, that I am not smart enough, not good enough, not professional enough. And the thing that hurt the most was not always the overt racism. It was the subtle stuff. The way people would compliment me on being well-spoken, as if they were surprised. The way people would suggest that maybe I should change my hair or my clothes, or the way I talk to be more professional. The way people would make little comments that told me I needed to be less black to be accepted. She looked directly at Margaret. What you said just now, about not being able to understand news anchors, that is part of that same system. That is you telling black people that the way we speak is wrong. And I need you to understand that those words have power. They have impact. Whether you meant them that way or not. Emily, Margaret's daughter, spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet but clear. Mom, I think you need to apologize to the Williams family and to everyone watching. What you said was wrong. Margaret looked at her daughter, then at Steve, then at the Williams family. When she spoke, her voice was shaking. I am sorry. I truly did not mean to hurt anyone, but I can see now that what I said was hurtful and wrong. I was making assumptions based on my own biases that I did not even realize I had. Steve Harvey nodded. That is a start. But I want you to do more than apologize. I want you to learn from this. I want you to think about the assumptions you make when you hear someone speak. I want you to question why you think there is only one right way to communicate. I want you to recognize that your discomfort with the way someone speaks might not be about professionalism, but about your own biases. He turned to the camera. And I want everyone watching to understand something. This is not about canceling Margaret. This is not about destroying her. This is about education. This is about recognizing that we all have biases, conscious and unconscious, and that those biases affect the way we see the world and the way we treat people. What Margaret said was wrong. But the fact that she said it without even realizing it was racist, that is a symptom of a bigger problem. And we cannot fix that problem by staying silent. Marcus Williams, Patricia's husband, spoke for the first time. I appreciate Steve for calling this out. Because too often, these kinds of comments get made and everyone just moves on. Black people have to smile and act like it does not hurt. We have to pretend we did not notice. We have to be the bigger person and not make white people uncomfortable by pointing out racism. And I am tired of that. I am tired of protecting other people's comfort at the expense of my dignity. Steve Harvey sat down on the edge of the stage. We are not playing a game anymore today. What we are doing right now is more important than any game. We are having a conversation about race and bias, and the responsibility we have to confront these things when we see them. He looked at Margaret's family. Bill, Tyler, Josh, how are you feeling right now? Bill Collins, Margaret's husband, spoke carefully. Honestly, I am uncomfortable. I am embarrassed. And I am ashamed that I did not immediately recognize that what my wife said was problematic. I should have known better. Tyler, the son, added, I think we have gotten comfortable with certain ways of talking that we do not question. We make assumptions about professionalism and standards without recognizing that those standards are often based on white cultural norms. And that is something I need to confront in myself. The conversation continued for nearly 90 minutes. Steve brought in a diversity educator who happened to be at the studio for another project, someone who could provide professional context for what had happened and how to move forward. They talked about microaggressions and unconscious bias, and the difference between intent and impact. They discussed how language shapes perception and how standards of professionalism have historically been used to exclude people of color. The Williams family shared their experiences with racism, both overt and subtle. They talked about code switching and the exhaustion of having to perform respectability to be taken seriously. They talked about the ways they had been judged for their names, their hair, their speech patterns, their cultural expressions. The Collins family listened. They asked questions. They sat with their discomfort instead of trying to rush past it. And Margaret, to her credit, did not try to defend herself further. She listened to the Williams family describe the impact of comments like hers, and she cried, and she acknowledged that she had caused harm. When the episode finally aired 4 weeks later, it was preceded by a special introduction from Steve Harvey explaining that what viewers were about to see was difficult but important. The producers had debated whether to air it at all, knowing it would be controversial. But Steve had insisted. If we do not air this, we are saying that racism only matters when it is convenient, when it is not uncomfortable. And that is exactly the problem. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Some viewers praised Steve for confronting racism directly and refusing to let it slide. Others criticized him for making a big deal out of what they saw as an innocent comment. The divide was stark and largely predictable, with people of color overwhelmingly supporting Steve's response, and many white viewers arguing that Margaret had been unfairly attacked. But the conversations that mattered most were the ones happening in living rooms and workplaces across the country. People were talking about microaggressions, many for the first time. White people were beginning to recognize how their comments about someone being well-spoken or articulate might be rooted in racist assumptions. People of color were sharing their experiences with having their speech policed and judged. Margaret Collins gave an interview 3 months after the episode aired. That day on Family Feud was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life, but it was also one of the most important. I had been walking through the world thinking I was not racist, because I did not use slurs or treat people differently based on their race. But what I did not realize was that I had absorbed racist ideas about what is professional and what is acceptable and what is normal, and those ideas came out in the way I talked about other people. She continued, I have spent the last 3 months doing the work, reading books about racism and bias, listening to people of color talk about their experiences, attending workshops, and I have realized how much I did not know, how much I had taken for granted. How many times I had probably said things that hurt people without even realizing it. Loretta Williams also gave an interview, speaking about the experience from her perspective. When Margaret made that comment, my first instinct was to let it go, to not make a scene, to protect her feelings at the expense of my dignity, because that is what Black people are taught to do. But Steve did not let it go, and I am grateful for that, because silence in the face of racism is complicity. And if we keep staying silent to make other people comfortable, nothing will ever change. 5 years after the episode aired, Steve Harvey did a retrospective interview about the most impactful moments from his career. The Margaret Collins episode changed me because I realized that I have a platform and a responsibility, and if I see racism happening in front of me and I do not call it out, I am part of the problem. It would have been easier to laugh off her comment, to move on with the game, to not make everyone uncomfortable. But easier is not always right. He continued, what people do not understand is that Margaret is not the villain of that story. She is a symptom. She represents a system that has taught people that there is one right way to speak, one right way to look, one right way to be professional, and that way is white. So when she said she could not understand news anchors, she was not being intentionally cruel. She was repeating an idea she had absorbed from the culture around her. But that does not make it acceptable. It just means we have to confront not just individual people, but the system that taught them to think that way. The episode became required viewing in diversity training programs across the country. Universities used it in classes about media representation and unconscious bias. Companies showed it to employees to spark conversations about microaggressions in the workplace. It became a cultural touchstone, referenced whenever conversations about casual racism emerged. 10 years after the episode, both the Williams family and the Collins family gave a joint interview about their experience. They had stayed in touch in the years since, with Margaret making genuine efforts to learn and grow. The families had exchanged letters and eventually phone calls, and had developed an unlikely friendship built on the foundation of that difficult conversation. I am not friends with Margaret because she is perfect now, Loretta Williams said. I am friends with her because she did the work, because she listened, because she was willing to sit with her discomfort and learn from it. That is what reconciliation looks like. Not perfection, but genuine effort. Margaret added, I will never fully understand what it is like to be black in America. I will never experience the kind of racism that the Williams family has experienced. But I can listen. I can learn. I can do better. And I can use my privilege to speak up when I see other people making the same mistakes I made. If you have been moved by this story of confrontation, education, and the refusal to let racism go unchallenged, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this with someone who needs to understand the impact of microaggressions. Share this with someone who has experienced the kind of casual racism that Margaret displayed. Remember that racism is not just hate crimes and slurs. Racism is also the casual comments about someone being articulate or well-spoken, the assumptions about professionalism based on how someone sounds, the suggestion that there is one right way to communicate, and it happens to be the white way. Margaret Collins did not think she was being racist when she made that comment about news anchors. She thought she was just making an observation. But that is how racism works most of the time. It is not always conscious or intentional. It is the ideas we absorb from the culture around us and repeat without questioning. Steve Harvey could have laughed it off. He could have moved on with the game. He could have protected everyone's comfort by staying silent. But he did not. He stopped everything. He called it out. He refused to let it slide. That is what allies do. That is what people with platforms and microphones should do when they witness discrimination. Not stay silent to avoid discomfort, but speak up even when it is hard. The Williams family had probably experienced hundreds of moments like the one Margaret created. Hundreds of times when someone made a comment that suggested they were not professional enough or articulate enough or acceptable enough. And hundreds of times they probably stayed quiet to avoid making others uncomfortable. But not that day. That day, Steve Harvey made sure their discomfort mattered more than Margaret's. Made sure the conversation happened. Made sure millions of people learned what microaggressions are and why they matter. That is what this story is about. Not canceling Margaret, but refusing to let racism be comfortable.